Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The King and the Mockingbird from 1980, or as is also known, Le Roi et l'Oiseau, is a French animated film and is directed by French animation great Paul Grimault, an evil king who lords over this kind of surreal, odd kingdom. His name is King Charles. 5 plus 3 equals 8 plus 8 equals 16, and he is very hated throughout his kingdom. He has tons of idols made in his image, and he has a police force that looks after everything. He goes back to his secret apartment where he takes a painting that is made in his likeness and he puts it up, and there's two pictures of a chimney sweep and a shepherdess who have a long love affair and fallen in love, and the king's reproduction sees them falling in love, and they all come out of the paintings because you can do that in this movie. They run off to be in love so she doesn't have to marry the king. As the king says, as it was written. They don't tell you where it was written, but it was written apparently. And they try to escape a painting of the king, who eventually takes out the real king and takes charge of the kingdom to kind of hunt them down and eventually win the affections of the shepherdess, or basically just marry her without her consent. All this time, Mr. Wonderbird, or the Mockingbird, is trying to foil the king's plans while also help the chimney sweep and the shepherdess get away and be able to fall in love together this whole time. And they help him out. He gets them out of all sorts of messes while trying to hurt the king and destroy his evil plans. This film has a very long production history. In fact, I'd actually previously seen, and what I thought I'd probably be reviewing, was the 1952 version. You can buy it on budget DVDs, and I had originally kind of bought it on a lark. I thought, oh, this will be another stupid, cheapy animated film that somehow lost its rights, and it's often called The Curious Adventures of Mr. Wonderbird. It's a very different film. It's a lot shorter. It was about 71 minutes. This is about 90 minutes. What happened was Paul Grimault lost the rights, and they had a falling out with his producing partner, and he eventually got them back and completed this film and got it released in 1980 or 19. It says it played in festivals in 1979, and then eventually got released in 1980 in the finished version. And a lot of the complaints I heard, because I really did fall in love with the 1952 version, and I'm slightly wishing I had rewatched that because I didn't realize, I guess, how different they would be. The 1952 version, I showed it to an older animator that I know who's a teacher, and he said it was very over animated. There's just like too much going on during it. And this film still has a lot going on, but it's not as prevalent, and the animation is still surreal, but a lot simpler at the same time. The storytelling is a lot more refined. It's still very surreal and sometimes goes into avenues that I've seen animated films where they do things just because it looks cool and for the sake of the surreal. This film doesn't really do that. It just like has odd sequences that I don't really understand the point of, but I liked, like where the Mockingbird explains to the chimney sweep and the shepherdess how the earth revolves around the sun, or there's a part where the king is watching like this weird kind of jester dance. It's a very strange French surreal animated film. I've always looked at this film as kind of animated classic, and I think it really is, not only because it was such an influence on Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata of Studio Ghibli, and they actually got it released in Japan and had it become kind of a hit in Japan. They released it under the Studio Ghibli label, or under like subsidiary Studio Ghibli label, and got it to be a hit in Japan, and even restored it and put out a very nice DVD of the film in Japan, which I unfortunately can't get a copy of. But they often talk about how it's the closest to literature they've ever seen in animated film, and its use of space. It does have a really interesting use of space, and it has a very surreal, playful quality to it. I often think the castle in this looks like Spirited Away, and the main policeman in it looks like those heads that are in the Queen Witch Lady's throne room in Spirited Away. They look very similar, and it looks like Spirited Away was very influenced by this film, as well as people say his first film, which I haven't seen at this point, The Castle of Cagliostro. This is based on a Hans Christian Andersen story called The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep, and I don't know how close this is to that, but those characters seem pretty dull, whereas The King and the Mockingbird felt very alive to me. They're really interesting characters, but there's a lot of times where this film is very silent, and you're just like watching cool animation, and it kind of reminds me of 40s and 30s stuff, some Fleischer in a lot of places. You're just never sure what's going to happen, and it really starts off when you see the castle. I mean, the castle reminds me of the castle in Spirited Away, but it's so much more surreal. I mean, it's pretty much like every theory of architecture ever invented is part of this castle. I mean, there's no way this could be a real building. It really highlights what animation can do in the sense of like that live action film can't do, and a sense of timelessness. Even though this film actually started production in 1948 and it came out then in 52, and then eventually came out in 1980. You can kind of get the sense of that, but you also don't. And I think that's something animation has that live action almost never have, is a sense of timelessness. You can, even in the most timeless of live action films, you can pretty much tell the era it was made in. I can tell it was made a while ago, but I could never really pinpoint when it was made, probably because it was made in so many different years, and it kind of works for it. There's certain times where you can tell the animation differences because he put more parts in and reanimated some sequences and used some older sequences, but it still flows very well for a film that had such a long and varied production history. It flows very, very well, and it's definitely a feast to behold. You know, if you're someone who really likes watching animation, this is an absolute classic, one of the films you should definitely see, not just because of the Studio Ghibli influence, but because it's such a surreal, odd animated film. It doesn't adhere to any sort of structure. I mean, it's kind of all over the place. This sense of wonder, this sense of surrealism, you don't really get from a lot of animated feature films. They're very structured and rigid, especially more so now. And when you look at The King and the Mockingbird, it really has a sense of aliveness to it, a surrealness, a playfulness in the sets and in the castles and in the character design and in what's happening. There's giant robots come in at one point, paintings come alive and are real characters. You finally have policemen who have kind of wings and hang out in a bird cage. You have all these different things going on that come out of nowhere. It feels like a little kid playing, little kid on opium playing with a French accent. It's very European and very odd and surreal and strange and arty, but that all seems to work for it. This is certainly an amazing achievement. Such an alive, interesting animated film like The King and the Mockingbird. I've always really appreciated this film, just its surreal nature to it. When I pick films I just want to review that aren't part of a series or a new movie or anything like that, they're basically films that I just like kind of wandered about, kind of just thought about, kind of the strange oddness to it. And I think this is definitely one of them, but sometimes, you know, I've reviewed those and I look at them and I go, I think I might have just liked this because it was very strange and odd. And that's definitely part of it with this film, especially with this film. But if you like animation, this is one of the unseen classics that you definitely should see. The 52 version is online. I recommend that one, but I recommend even higher the 1980 version. If you can get your hands on that, that would be great. And it has so many different names. I mean, it was called The King and the Mockingbird, The King and the Bird, The Curious Adventures of Mr. Wonderbird, The King and Mr. Bird, Mr. Bird to the Rescue, and The Adventures of Mr. Wonderful. It was actually cut up into pieces and shown in various kids programs in the 50s. They'd have a week where it'd be like Mr. Wonderbird week, and Monday you'd get one segment, Tuesday another, kind of like what they did to the G.I. Joe movie. Just appreciating the style enough makes it a memorable film, but the surprise and the wonderment that's on display through The King and the Mockingbird is worth at least one watch, if not multiple viewings. And I always come back to this film because I'm like, I can't believe like that's real. So if you've seen The King and the Mockingbird and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.